Hi, everyone. It's Iliya Mirochnik here, and on behalf of myself and New Masters Academy, I am once again here to liven up your day in this particularly difficult time of crisis. So I'm coming to you from my quarantine to yours, and I know that right now we're all concerned for ourselves, but even more so for our loved ones, our families. And I also know that we still want to have a semblance of what our lives were like before this. And here is why New Masters and its wonderful instructors, myself included, are offering to conduct these free critiques. And the final thing I want to talk about before we jump into these critiques is that if you are a subscriber to New Masters, definitely check out the coaching program. There are some great coaches, myself included, and it's a wonderful opportunity to not just partake in the wonderful content of New Masters, but also to be able to have constant interaction with someone who can critique the work and and just kind of help guide you along the way, along the process of learning. So with that, let's take a look at some work.
Okay, I'm going to begin this critique by this drawing sent by Alberto Fuenzalida. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So let's take a look. So, a few things I like, primarily the head. Um, that I do think the axes of symmetry are pretty good. Let's get some stuff on the page so that we can work with here, right? The axes of what is going on? Oh, sorry, it's just a bit too transparent. The axis of, right, that axis seems okay. This one seems fine. All of these, more or less, right? They're sort of good, and this is that's something I work with a lot with students, and often see issues when it comes to this. Of course, they could be maybe a little bit more parallel, but that at the same time not the most fundamental thing at this point. But okay, so that I like. I like how things move, how the neck kind of culminates in the pit of the neck at the sternal notch of the manubrium. I like the sort of, not that I see the clavicles that well, but I like that I can kind of infer where they are, and they seem to be more or less in the right place. Central line of the torso. Here we're losing it, right? There's a little bit of that twist, but I'm not getting it. Um, and I'm losing some stuff down here. And of course, this position of the leg is very complicated. So um, let's make some corrections to what, I always tend to think a lot of the problems can be solved with outlines and just figuring out what the contours are and why, right? And then, of course, we can work some of the internal forms. And we'll start from the top. So the first thing, right? We have the clavicle, meaning that it has to end uh, at the shoulder in something known as the acromion process of the spine of the scapula. So the spine of the scapula in the back is this like protruding part on the scapula, and it hovers above the bones of the humerus, and of course comes into contact with the clavicle. This is the view from the back. So from the front, the spine of the scapula is a little bit below it, a little bit below the clavicle. So I'm just going to start to carve, and the idea is that the trapezius, right, inserting into there. This is of prime importance to really try to establish. Oh my goodness, sorry about that. Is to prime importance to try to establish a planar change um, at the acromion process. So here, that's somewhat happening, right? I'm reading these angular changes, and that's good because this right here is that combination of end of the clavicle and the acromion process of the scapula. That a similar thing needed to be done here. It's very minor, but it makes a big difference. Now, following down from there, I do think, right, the insertion here is of the pectoralis. And that means, this is underneath, that means that the armpit on this arm has to be brought down a little bit, and you can see how that is already actually more in line with the armpit on the other side. So there's a symmetry there that you're preserving, but also making sure that the anatomy is making sense there. So the same thing is happening here. Now, regardless of what image you used, right? This is sort of a problem, mainly because you like just with the placement of this hand completely obscures the lower arm, right, where the forearm is. And this, of course, presents some issues. How to achieve this, how to change this, is going to be a little bit difficult, but it's not impossible. I would have probably moved the forearm a little bit. In general, oh God, this is a tough one, right? This is a tough one because of it's pulled back, right? Let's get that a little bit brighter. Because it's pulled back, right? It seems like it's so much shorter than the upper arm here. So probably maybe the arm could have come down a little bit. This is not the color that I want, right? Could have come down a little bit, gripped the cloth, maybe maybe straightened, maybe just went a little bit lower and was placed on the abdomen a little bit, stuff like that. There's a lot of options here, and it would have taken a number of attempts to really get it right. This is sort of a common problem. I dealt with this a lot in school, the Rep Academy, where my teachers would come, just erase the arm, tell me, oh, maybe it was even okay. Maybe even like from an anatomical standpoint, everything was fine, but just from the particular angle wasn't working. Compositionally, something was off. It didn't go with the general like movement and gesture of the rest of the parts of the body, right? That's where you're really thinking on how to compose. Now, it's important to to make sure you know the anatomy, to get it all right, to proportions, blah blah. But in the end, what's really going to help you make this interesting is how these parts all come together. Now, here I would want to just right here expand a little bit towards the bottom. This would be the brachialis a little bit, we can say, and then on top here I would just try to get something to where we could see right here the ridge group, right, of the forearm, the brachioradialis, the extensor carpi radialis longus, brevis, all of those, right? They begin at the epicondylar ridge of the at the epicondylar ridge of the humerus, which is above the epicondyles, a little bit higher. So they would begin right there, meaning start those forms higher. Start them on the humerus itself. Now, this hand also is posing a little bit of a problem because of this like the gaps between here are equal, and they're like almost identical to the fingers themselves. So the gaps are the same as the fingers themselves. Each one is kind of in business for itself, right? Try to group them a little bit more. This angle is not the best. Also, some movement here would have been good. Maybe even hiding. Maybe turning the hands. That's kind of slightly behind the knee, giving you a chance to define the knee a little bit more. But in general, right? The classic is right. That's let's say the back of the hand, and then the classic is the grouping is something like this. The grouping can be something like this. The grouping can also be something like this, right? But what you don't want is 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? It's not one of those. It's not like a hand turkey. is that's not what you want there. Now, what we definitely need down here is hints, if you can, at the ASIS, right? The anterior superior iliac spine, right here. So something in there can be hinting at, even if it's not exactly at this place, right? It should, that seems a little bit high even, but that's okay. I'd rather it be in accented a bit more, so that all these forms of the abdomen, of the obliques, and you know, of the my God, of the aponeurosis, of the abdomen, abdominal aponeurosis, right, coming off of the obliques and housing the abdomen itself, the rectus abdominis, can all sort of tuck into the areas at the pelvis, giving you more of a sense of a pelvis in this area. Now, for the thigh below it, without getting too specific of what the anatomy is doing, I would, right, kind of square off the pelvis a little bit. It gives you a little bit more of a hint of a pelvis and doesn't like sweep it under too fast. Okay? So moving on to here, maybe a little bit, right, kind of getting a little bit more on the contours of the leg, making sure you have the medial malleolus a little bit clearer, and of course, right, the different sort of parts, peroneus, gastrocnemius, all those things, right, kind of follow the contours a little bit more accurately. Don't allow it to just be one long sweep. The foot's actually pretty good here, and even this foot up there is good. What I do want though is maybe slight elongation on the toes, right, and a similar kind of a grouping could take place right here, right? Slight elongation, and then that already kind of just looks more like a foot. Now, the thing is, maybe from your angle, maybe the foot of the model did look like this, but you need it to look like a foot on paper. And for this, I recommend kind of going towards a little bit more of a classical kind of understanding of what the form of a foot looks like. The Greeks are great for this, right? The toes are just made longer, and from a front view, they are sort of they taper outwards, right? So they sort of look a little bit more like this. Michelangelo is of course ideal for toes, but he would look at the Greeks. So you know, you might as well take it to the source a little bit in this case, right? And then kind of just elongate these things a little bit. And then the rest, the form as you have it, is pretty good. So that is just from a general sort of constructive approach to the contour. And this is the main thing to focus on here. Now, the other thing, very quickly, I would like to go over before moving on, is what to do with the background. And I think the cloth, whoa, strange color, the cloth as you have it is maybe a tad distracting, right? I don't think it needs these edges. I think, you know, one or two places you can kind of hint at. Maybe it's a darker value all down there, maybe down here, right? Just see already, I just kind of subdue it. We know it's cloth. There's no need to overstate this, right? You know that's cloth, you know that that's there. Without doing too much to what you have, you can just sort of kind of push back the background, have enough of a hint of cloth to give you this information that you need, and then ignore all the details. Look, even just getting rid of that, now I'm looking at the model. I'm looking at what this piece initially was about. It was not about the cloth. Not to say that you can't have a combination of both, but I think in this case, right, the cloth, in order to be, you know, a major part of everything, had to probably wrap around in some interesting way. You know, something else had to happen. Here, it's just a cloth on a chair. It was probably accidental. It was probably, you know, because the model didn't want to have a seat on just the chair in the room, and they threw a cloth down. That is not reason enough to do it. Okay, so just keep in mind, you're in charge of what we observe, what we take home from your piece as the viewer. Okay. The other final thing I want to add is, maybe try to keep the edge of the hair softer to the edge of her face, right? The edge of the head. Kind of allow that, because otherwise it begins to look a little bit too much like a wig. Okay, this was definitely a fun one to critique. Thank you, and I'm going to move on. Okay, so this is a piece submitted by CD.art, and I particularly enjoy seeing sort of the attentive detail, like the attention to detail in terms of anatomy here, right? Like everything is very kind of clearly defined. You're following along. Oopsie daisies, that's a bit too wide. Following along like the forms of the rib cage, like you're kind of defining the anatomy, the particular muscular forms, right? I'm seeing very sort of attentive detail to getting those halftones on each side, right, to model the curvatures. All that's pretty good. The model is of great help here because he was clearly very muscular. Now, I like all that. I like what I'm seeing. But I do want to sort of home in on the more obvious problems, the ones that will kind of, when solved, will allow for a much stronger piece. Before I get to that, and in this case, it's particularly the tonality, the general tonality. I do want to mention a few things. I tend to think, I'm looking here, that the knees are a little bit narrow, and then the lower leg is also just a little bit narrower than it needs to be, and it seems to be getting smaller. So I think if the foot were larger, the ankles wider on both legs, this would definitely help. So let's just pick the color we have, and why not just like add it in to see what it looks like as a whole, right? So let's just color that in and look at what's going on in terms of why these things look, how much more of a sort of a proper proportional human being this dude becomes, right? So even just that much, right? The general rule, I mean, maybe his arms were extremely muscular, right? So like the arms maybe can come in a little bit, forearms most definitely, the bicep there, the forearm here is a little bit wide as well. I'll just take this here a little bit wide, a little bit higher actually, get that lighter, right? So just correcting for that. Now, see already the legs seem more massive than the arms. Even if that's not happening, or at least it seems as though it's not happening, it probably is, right? This is a common mistake, and usually happens when you kind of get focused on one particular part. You're sort of taking the proportions within an area, right? So you're taking the proportions of the leg, the width to the height, and all that seems fine, but it's not in relation to the upper leg, and the leg as a whole is not in relation to the arms, right? In general, this is not to say that this is always the case, but aim to make the ankles wider than the wrists. I see this problem all the time. Try to avoid that, and then I think if you just think that way, the proportions will be set in place a lot, in a way that's a lot more convincing. But that being said, let's get to the actual, like the problems that I'm seeing in terms of light and shadow. Now, because of the modeling of all the anatomy, I think some of the halftones are all the same value, right? So let's just outline them. These halftones, some of these halftones, some of the ones on the arm, the forearm, the leg right here. Those are all most likely halftones. I really doubt that the forms there are protruding enough to create strong shadows. And then something like this whole area, filled with light that's reflecting into what clearly seems like a shadow, definitely seem too light. And if you just compare, right, I can pick that color, I can put it down right here. That's your shadow color. And I can pick this halftone color, or rather value, and put it down right here. And look what happens. Clearly, your halftones are a darker value than your reflected lights. This should never happen. Instead, right, if you're simplifying, you have a cylindrical object, right? You have your terminator, right, that border of light and shadow. And then you have the shadow itself, core shadow with a little bit of the reflected light, right? All that stuff. You can do that indefinitely, right? Kind of modify that, but you have to stop modifying that and think of it as a group as soon as you introduce your halftones. So it's that terminator that clearly separates these groups of values. This all has to be a darker value than your halftones, no matter how dark they seem. And most of the time, the darker halftones will seem much darker because they're surrounded by shadows or there's a bright highlight, so you want to like emphasize them. Whereas the reflected light always seems a lot lighter because it's surrounded by the darker shadows. But the trick is don't get too caught up in the specifics or you lose it, right? Or you lose those global relationships. So let's get into the actual terminator, which I think you're showing here. The terminator is that separation between your light and shadow. So I'm just going to emphasize it, right? I'm just going to tone it down a little bit, right? It's got some softer edges there. This is all down here. I can enlarge this a little bit. I'm just going to knock back, maybe that's too much. I'm just going to knock back some of those reflected lights, right? Just knock that leg back, knock that shadow there, right? Now it's getting a little bit darker than maybe you need it, but that's fine with me. I'm going to remove what I did here, kind of carve in from that side. We get maybe a little bit clearer bit of light against the leg. So that's right. Now, this maybe pushed things a little too dark, right? I'm not reading the reflected lights, which we still need. I'm not saying we don't need them. So we're going to have them a little bit. So I'm going to reintroduce them along the edge, just somewhere, maybe a little bit down here, maybe a little bit, on the leg. But now the important bit is, how do we sort of lighten up these halftones? So I could just slightly kind of do a glaze, right? Almost, in oil painting, it would be maybe a transparent bit of color there. Right? Just make sure that our lights are clearly reading like lights, right? I'm just subduing some of those darker halftones. So even as is, right? I still think this leg can probably, the lower leg can probably come down a little bit. But that's okay. I don't think that's the most important thing I'd like to focus on here. And then, right, and then we can play with the gradient. Our lights are clearly coming from up top. So it's up here that we're going to get, it's true, some of the lighter values, kind of eating up some of these halftones. And then, of course, your highlights, right? And your highlights, right, probably at the innermost creases between forms and the outermost changes in plane, places like that. Of course, the edge of the highlight begins to matter. Right here, I would enhance some of this to show more of the opening, kind of that like arch of the rib cage, maybe one or two little bits of light along the center line, even though that's a little bit too close to the shadow, and we can begin to subdue it a little bit. And then you can see already, even just without changing any of the outlines really, without kind of overstating, without kind of focusing on anatomy or anything at this point. I think this hair is a bit big though, right? Like the head looks so small because of this giant mop of hair, which maybe he had, but I just think hair, try to make it as large as the cranium allows for it, right? Like, and if it surpasses it, you get a little bit too much. So the head itself, right? Oh boy, can get a little bit larger and moved over. I'm just going to remove this whole bit. Just kind of get rid of that line they made. Right, so the head can become a little bit larger. Oh boy, sorry about that crop. Let me just fix that again. Right, so that can become a little bit, like the head can become larger to the cranium, and the hair can come in, and you have a more like proper relationship of cranium to the head as a whole. And then Now, with the leg, right, you don't want to maybe bring those highlights as light as the ones on top. So true that some of the darker halftones are going to be important here to still show a highlight, but still for you to have a hierarchy of highlight, right? These are the brightest ones on top. Let me just switch this to a different color. These are the brightest highlights on top, and then it tones down as you move down here. And of course, the general relationships come down, right? The whole idea is that you're never thinking in value individually. You're thinking of contrast, and contrast is always two or more values side by side, and that's where you need to get that, like the global understanding of the big light, the big shadow, and then the big gradient within the light, and the big gradient within the shadow. Now, one thing about this pose is it seems as though his leg is on a thing, right? It's on a block of some sort. This is the only way this makes sense to me. Otherwise, it's as if he just lifted up his leg. And I don't think that you need to get these right angles, right? Right angles, we need to try to, right? There's a right angle between the upper and lower legs there. And I think, right, if it were here, perhaps, that's as a pose, a little bit more dynamic and it creates a shape that's more interesting. This is once again this idea of how do you compose everything, right? Anatomy is one thing, values super important. All this is super important, but in the end, um, where these things are matters. And I think this is where you can really begin to work from imagination. You know, do what you can from life, from the photograph. Do what you can. Be as you know as precise as you feel you need to be. But then think to yourself, not every photo is perfect. Not every angle of the model. Like you're standing in a room, a bunch of people are working from a model. Generally, the pose may be super interesting. Maybe from your angle, one or two things are lining up in a way that's not that dynamic. Then all you got to do is change it. In school, we would for these bits of time, ask our models to pose slightly differently for individual people in the class, right? Individual people outside, say, on one side of the model, while, it's a long pose, so everyone's working on parts at a time, while, let's say, half the class is working up here and nothing has to change. The other half of the class, for whom, let's say, this position of the leg isn't working that well, can ask him to put down his leg so we can, so that we could do something else from our angle, right? The goal is what's the most convincing thing on paper, not what was in front of you, right? So that's the important thing. So I'm not saying that's the only way to change this, but perhaps that could have been one that that would have been maybe a little bit more dynamic and possibly maybe make this a little bit more of a contrapposto even, right? Maybe this whole leg comes in a little bit more and supports his weight a little bit more than it had been prior, right? With it moved out where it was. So that's definitely something to think about. But in this case, most importantly, what we needed was a very clear separation of light and shadow. And after that, we can then talk about anatomy, overlaps, highlights as they're defining anatomical forms, and so on. Okay, I this was definitely enjoyable, and I think a lot of points, a lot of important things I managed to cover. So I'm going to move on, but I do now, actually looking back a little bit, it's like kind of, this is the advantage of Procreate, right? I can shrink it as if I'm looking, as if I'm standing far away without actually moving. I do think the arm is still maybe a little bit massive, and I would have cut it down, and maybe it's just a tiny bit smaller. I'm gonna try this. I don't know if it'll work, but let's try it. What if we do this, and then we can slightly subdue it, right? Just get it down like that. A little bit smaller, right? Proportionally to the legs, to the torso, that looks a little bit better. That does not, so that this isn't distracting, right? So that this is not distracting. I'll just get rid of those lines. I do think the hand, though, could have been a little bit larger as a mass, right? So I'm just gonna carve that out, then shrink it, and then carve out the hand. And I think How is that? That's too big. So we can then begin to carve it back, right? So I think that as a size for a hand works a little bit better than what we had. And then of course, as you're carving and defining it, it can become a little bit smaller than that. But hands are too small, and the feet were too small as well. So that's also not to be too concerned about. This is a common mistake. Just try to step back, try to see the whole piece at all times, right? You work a little bit on the detail, step back and reassess how that detail, uh, how it relates to the piece as a whole. Okay, thank you, and let's move on. So this next piece was uploaded by L2 Diamante or I2 Diamante. I couldn't tell the difference whether it's an I or an L, so I apologize if something there went wrong and I mispronounced the name. Okay, so in terms of certain painting qualities in his head, I do think they're good, and I like the complexity that where we achieve. I'm going to switch to some more painterly things. I don't want to go too much into like painterly effect, but um, okay, but at least it'll allow me to apply paint properly. So I like that the upper parts of the head are in a darker halftone, and then you're only seeing light on the nose, upper lip, and the chin. There's something very something complex about that, a little more dynamic, not what we usually see with just a light on top and then everything else kind of subduing in gradient as you move down. So I like that. Um, but there are still a few things I would like to talk about. Now, the first thing is that if this eye is correct, and I do think it looks like it's in the right place, I think something with this eye is a little bit off. And the advantage, of course, of using Procreate, as always, right, is that I can carve and cut and move things around. So if I move this eye just a little bit down and a little to the left, and then, oh boy, and then just remove some of that other stuff. Right? I think that already as placement is a little bit better, right? I think they're just now they feel a little bit more equidistant from the center line at this particular tilt. Now, Robert Henry, as well as oh my God, uh, Robert Henry is the one who really as well as Harold Speed in his painting book. There we go. Makes it a point that when painting the whites of the eyes, paint them the same value as the skin and also even the same color, right? So just getting rid of them. Because what was here before was things were a little too close, like the value of the whites of the eyes, especially if they're darker. They always seem lighter, right? Because the iris is dark, the shadows there are dark, everything in the orbits are dark. But look at that. Like I've toned them away. They no longer conflict with the values in the background. And from here on, it's possible to figure out how we can, make them a little bit more like the sclera as it is, right? Kind of cool it down a little bit. Maybe it's getting a little bit softer in these places. Right? In general, you only need one or two areas of that cool color to show the whites of the eyes as they are. But now, once initially painted, the value of the cheek, let's say, it's easier to get the value right of that cooler color that you can place on top of that. In Robert Henry's case, you can actually see it. He doesn't even change it. It's usually just often the same color as the cheek, and yet it looks totally fine. So that's what I recommend here. And the other thing is that maybe, oh boy, that's too much. The other thing is that maybe only one of them, maybe only one of the eyes needs to be one of the little bits of sclera, right? Needs to be a little cooler. Um, the other one can be a little bit more just, we can keep it that value of the skin. But the way to really show it as light would be to tone down the iris. And let's see if that works, right? And that also can heighten the eye, like we can take a look at the eye a little bit more. That may be a little bit too much. Possibly a way to solve this would be to just soften it from this point on, right? But that would be something to consider if you want to focus the eyes, make the sclera look light enough. Maybe just the contrasts needed to be as light as that. Moving down a little bit, the wing of the nose, right, that little bit on the side, is side plane. And of course, it's catching a little bit of light up top right there, but it should never compete with the front plane in this kind of lighting situation. I think this crease maybe is a little overdone. I think we can subdue it and still have it be enough, right? I'm just gonna hatch over it, and to show it as lighter, maybe just a little bit lighter on the upper lip in that area, the corner. I think possibly sharper edge on some of these shadows under the nose, and you can see how the nose now kind of begins to have a form because that front plane is clearly the value it needs to be. Same thing going on with the corners of the mouth, maybe a little bit overstated, so I'm just going to subdue it a little bit. And of course, I don't see the initial image, I don't see the initial model, so there's a chance that I'm losing the likeness a little bit. But at the same time, I think it's still possible to make all these changes without loss of likeness, and actually with an increase of likeness once some of these basic sort of structural properties of the face and the way painting and light hits it are achieved. So that I think kind of clears these areas up just a bit, and that is, I would say, maybe all I would currently want to do to the head. I do think possibly with our light coming from this side, we can try a light glaze over this whole side of the face. Let's just enlarge this and just knock this back, knock this back, knock this back just a little bit more. This whole side of the face can be a little bit more subdued, a little bit more in just a solid value that's like it's not that it's much darker than it was, but it is a little bit more solid, as well as this area underneath and the neck can all kind of come together, right? You want to soften some of these edges so that our focus is the head, right? Our focus is everything up here. Switch that a little bit, right? It's everything up here, not down there. So that already I think kind of helps. It allows us to focus on the eye here, which is nice. And that, of course, could be something to keep working on. Now, this is a personal qualm of mine, when portraits are done in this weird sort of cut. So either there's a lot of empty space at the bottom, so you can totally recrop this, recut it, and that already looks a bit better. And then even then, though this is not enough, because clearly I think I would just continue all this down to the bottom. It doesn't need to have any detail, but it needs to exist as something more specific. I personally think. Now, I know some people tend to do this. There's this sort of portraits, paintings look a little less completed, not like a finished piece, but more like just, an immediate response to something from life in front of them. But at the same time, I do not just, if I pull back, you can just see how there's more environment in this way. So I don't think not painting to the bottom, which would only take a minute extra, is the way to go here, right? I think this is something to consider, because in the end, you want it to read like this. You want it to read like, the global relationships have to be preserved, and I think there's no, these are all sort of preparations for maybe larger portraits with arms and something like this. So why not have it go all the way down so you're seeing a person, right? You're seeing like a point of view which is all dependent on your crop. And this is that's the crux of it all, right? Now, I think there's a lot of repetition in this circular, right, this circular collar. And I think either it should be simplified or some of these overlaps, expansions and then overlaps again need to be a little bit more exaggerated. I also think that maybe there's a little bit more of a shadow behind him here, right? Maybe there's a little bit more of one right there. There's a little bit of a cast shadow underneath here too, down here, down there, stuff like that, right? So we can get a little bit more character in the actual clothing as well, right? Because that's not unimportant. That is a fundamental part of the portrait is how that clothing is describing the forms, how it's actually giving you the character of the model as well. So the final thing that I like to do is I would probably think about maybe finding some sharper edges in the hair in one or two spots. So just by sharpening that and maybe softening somewhere, here, maybe softening right below that, already kind of moves the eye around the head in a way that like allows you to focus in this area and then kind of relax, focus again in this area, relax, right? So you don't want an even edge all the way around the head, all the way around any form really. And a similar thing as with the cloth, I would push the background all the way to the edge, of course with gradients, of course with them, and possibly there's more of a shadow behind, right? Maybe there's some sort of hint of different values on top. Maybe even all of this now comes down a little bit. And see, and I think right now we have a much more composed portrait with a clear area for us to focus on as viewers, right? Always put yourself not just in the position of creator, but also in the position of audience, right? This is an important thing to keep thinking about. Now, the next thing, of course, but it's hard to say with photographs, but the next thing I would say is maybe some cooler colors in the head, right? Everything sort of on the, like, it seems as though that everything here, right, is warm, including the hair, the skin, the clothing, all of it's warm, and the background is just gray. So I think in order to unify it, maybe in some of these places, that's maybe too much, right? But just having some bits of cooler light, and I know that's there, but maybe just a little bit more of it, hit the head, can you tie it a little bit more to the background? Okay, I think this portrait has an enormous amount of potential, and I actually recommend maybe to keep going on it. So thanks for uploading. I'm gonna move on. This next piece was uploaded by ebfrank8, or as it says here, by Eric Barrera. I hope I said that right. And it seems as though that it's from my course. So this is definitely a pleasure to critique. So my course on New Masters is the academic approach, particularly focusing on drawing technique as it applies to anatomy, and then how to take that and move it to working from the live model. So this is from one of the earlier parts of the course where, of course, I'm going over the skull, the muscles of the face, and then it proceeds to everything else. So I like a lot of what I'm seeing here. The actual like hatching, or just the handling of the medium is looking good. I like to focus the eye on things, so that's something to talk about. So sketching, good. So I think maybe even some of this stuff in the back, right, on the back of the cranium could be a little bit lighter, right? Some of these things right here in the orbits can be a little bit lighter because we're not focusing on holes, we're not focusing on gaps, we're focusing on the forms that are most protruding because they are the ones that will capture our attention. And that's how we're going to show where something is closer and where something is farther away with the absence of a background, right? Like there is no background here, so this is even more important. If we had a background, this could have been achieved uh, achieved in a different way, right? It's all about contrast. So I'm going to soften some of this before moving on, get rid of some of these darker areas that are holes, and of course I'll put some of them back. So don't be too concerned. So now, a few things. I would like to carve this up into planes, first and foremost, right? And always begin with the front plane of the forehead, the frontal bone. Get that like this, and it is up. Hold on a second. Here, a second layer is necessary. Right here. So these are the superciliary arches. From their highest point to, let's say, the highest point of the frontal eminence, more or less, that is your front plane. Then, moving down from there, we get to this intermediary plane, right? This is not exactly side plane. Side plane we'll get to in a second. But this is an intermediary plane. Because the head is round, we're going from front to side by means of another plane. And that's your center line. Following this, the back edge of the zygomatic and the frontal bone as it moves up from the frontal process of the zygomatic bone up onto the zygomatic process of the. So, I'll repeat that. This right here is the frontal process of the zygomatic bone, and this right here is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. Following this back edge and into the temporal line, that's up top the beginning of your side plane. Now, following down here, pretty much, right? You can kind of follow along the front edge of the zygomatic. Zygomatic is also to some degree an intermediary plane. So you're going to have front, intermediary, and then the side on the zygomatic arch. Closer to the anterior and medial is where you're going to have that change of plane on the zygomatic itself before it becomes the upper jaw, or yes, let's call it that, the upper jaw. Now here, following, going from your canines and incorporating the four incisors, we have our front plane, and then immediately a jump to side plane here. Now in a head, this is all it's filled in with the muscles and the tissues of the cheek. So this in a head is an intermediary plane, but in a skull is not. But you can follow along down the chin to get more of the front plane right in there. And then there's a somewhat intermediary plane in the jaw, and then the side plane on the sort of the upward moving portion of the jaw, known as the ramus or rami of the mandible. So everything from this point, let's color it in, everything from here is side plane. These are crazy colors, sorry about that. And everything here, that's too much. Let's get it a little bit lighter. And everything here is, right, to simplify, I'm just simplifying. Everything here is your front plane. The gray and some of these scribbled orange marks are intermediary plane. Okay? So, that being said, how do we adjust the values on this skull? Now, I like that this is I like that this is a slightly darker value up here, right? Because our light's coming from here. So we're going to get to that. So I would also want to make sure that the values of the underside of the superciliary arches are knocked back down a little bit, right? So that all comes down. This here, I would say, is already time to kind of pull this back, right? To kind of make sure we're getting a separation between front and intermediary planes. And more specifically, begin to kind of get rid of some of this zygomatic arch, right? So our focus becomes on the zygomatic bone itself, catching a lot of light. I think this bit of light on the protuberance of the chin we can knock back. And now let's emphasize not get those darks back, but let's emphasize some of the margins of the bones where we need them, right? That's a ridge, knock that back. That's a ridge, knock that back a bit. Terminator, right? So it's not so much getting the whole, but it's getting the contrast on that front, on the closest plane, which also happens to be the intermediary plane as the edge between front and side. Now, I would also slightly subdue some of this underneath. I don't think we need so much of it, with a little bit of a accent on this part, right? This overlapping part. You can see the rhombus, and then it sort of continues as a form in this area. That thing is called the oblique line. And that's just something to knock back a little bit. I would possibly maybe push a little bit of the nasal cavity there, a little bit more, and I'm going to just knock back the teeth a little bit, right? The teeth are not that important. The teeth are more important when figuring out the major plane changes. And now I'm going to bring up a little bit more of a light. And I know this maybe wasn't the case, but who knows? Why not have it? And kind of pull out some of this intermediary plane, right? So what I'm doing is I'm correcting some of the anatomy, some of the plane changes. Not doing that much of it, but just enough to make things a little bit clearer, and then emphasizing the closest edge to us. Now, I know you don't necessarily have to use a lighter value for some of this, right? That's kind of maybe all you need, just a little bit of it. I'm just going to get a light up top as well. And so here, if you want teeth, maybe a couple of tiny little highlights on them. And then, right, kind of moving it along into the zygomatic. So see, without really changing that much, but just considering where those changes of plane are, a little more obviously, right, making them clear, making them stand out in terms of both contrast and clear edges of planes. It takes this whole skull to a new level, right? So I think don't worry so much about the hatching and getting the values, getting it to look clean. That's not the most important thing. That's something that will come with time and will be, and will be easier to do. And especially you'll see how much easier it is to do and how much, how much more precise it all looks when it's all kind of approached with the thinking of the when you have the form of the head in mind, right? When the larger structures are in place. Axes are good, I think. I think maybe some of these teeth at the bottom maybe are a little overstated. So, and usually you do get a little bit of a shadow from the upper row of teeth onto the lower row of teeth. So that's something to consider to help subdue some of that. And I think that makes it look a little scarier, but also a little bit more convincing. Now, that's not to say that I can't keep going and marking up some of these parts like the nasal spine and and figuring out what the nasal cavity is doing. I do want to bring this to everyone's attention though, since these are public critiques, and this is something I keep repeating. I think I'm just going to make it a little more clear now. The shape of the opening, right, the nasal cavity, the opening there, right, there's the arch on top, right there. That's a plane. Then it pulls back. This side is always correct. Everyone can see that side. The other side is a little more problem. This, then, is pulled back a little bit more. Then there's a plane that's flat again. Flatten this out. And so that one's down here. Not bad though. I'm not saying it's bad here. I just want to make this even more obvious. And then there's a plane that's almost horizontal, maybe at a little bit of a tilt down to the nasal spine. And that's right there. And once that's there, once that's totally in place, you can then round it off slightly and make sure it works. But most importantly, we need to have that read like a form in space and not like just a hole, right? Not just some sort of organic outline of the space there. Okay, with that said, I like how this looks. Some of these changes I think really pushed it, and I would not hesitate to go back and make these corrections, because I think I would just take all those wonderful qualities that the skull already had at the beginning and really elevate them to the next level. Okay, let's move on. So this next piece was uploaded by Honestka. Hope I'm saying that correctly. And it is very much in line with work that I do and I used to do ever since school, and I still keep doing. And this is the done in this sort of a red chalk. Now it's all different kinds of red chalk that you can get nowadays. Conte is usually sort of the go-to, and there's definitely a lot of stuff happening here that I like. The first thing that I have to just commend the creator of this piece for is the angle, right? I love this, like this tilt, this foreshortened angle of the head is definitely a challenge. It is definitely the one angle that's teaching you to, like a sculptor, to look at those angles we rarely see, right? From below, from above. It's allowing you to really get into how a face is constructed. A few things, structural things. I think that the frontal plane right here of the frontal bone on top needs to be more prominently situated in relation to the rest of the axes. So this upper margin has to, be along those lines. I do also think that maybe some of this stuff in the back, as usual, I like to slightly subdue. How do I do this? Slightly subdue some of the stuff in the back, just a little bit, right? Just to focus on the head more, right? Just to get the head a little bit more developed, a little bit more, right? Even just by getting rid of some of the stuff in the back, the head itself looks more completed. This is naturally going to happen when you focus your attention, when you focus the viewer's attention. So now that immediately gets some stuff out of the way. What I do want to do before getting into some of the specific things like eyes and all that, I would like to make sure there's a little bit more clarity in the front and side planes. So here, the zygomatic arch, I would accent a little bit more to give yourself that more of that clear structural analysis of the skull underneath for one, and the major changes in plane for two. And then I'm going to push this a little bit softer, right? Because there is this softness here that I do like. But even just getting that simpler, making like each of these plain distinctions a little bit more precise. There's that one, right? There's that one, right? Everything is kind of moving around like that. Makes it a little bit more convincing. Now, the creases, as effective as they are, need to be maybe not, like, don't have them kind of continue as line. Have them start off as line, then taper out a little bit as value, so that they're defining these forms a little bit more convincingly. Because as soon as you have a line on a page, it reads like a line on a page, right? So even something like this, that light, as soon as it's a line on a page, it just reads like that. And instead, you want it to be like a form. And the fastest way to do it without even looking is to make sure you start it, you finish it, you maybe ignore a little bit more halfway through, right? Your eye will end up finishing that line for you, as well as making sure it's not a line, but it's tapering out towards the bottom, tapering out towards the top, some sort of variation in it. I think these halves of the chin here have to come up a little bit to kind of turn that form a little bit more. I think some of the halftones under the lip can be a little bit more prominent. Stuff like that. I think there needs to be a little bit more clarity between the side plane of the nose and the front plane of the face. Now, of course, the highlight's here, right? The highlight is somewhere here, but we still most likely will have a little bit of a light somewhere in there, and maybe, I mean, I'm exaggerating this. I'm not saying it needs to be that bright, but maybe a little bit of a light somewhere on the uppermost part of the zygomatic. A similar thing will happen with the frontal bone and the superciliar arches, supraorbital margins, and stuff like that. A little bit more will happen maybe on the lip, in these places, maybe even a hint of a highlight on the nose. Now, of course, you can soften them, subdue them, make sure that things kind of work in tandem a little bit more, but in general, that's what I would go for here. So, in terms of the eye, this eye, the far eye, to me is really good. But what you need to try to do, no matter what you're looking at, I'm going to try to do this here, warp, is in general know that the outer corner is pushed further back into the head than the inner one. So by just making that adjustment, uniform, bring it down a little bit after that, just step back. That even if maybe that's not exactly what the model's eyes look like, right? Maybe not. But at the same time, it helps to get that rotation of the head, and you can see that it's because the orbits are at that angle, right? In general, the orbits, right, are like that on the head. The whole head comes up to a, a, a point at the center line. That's, to really simplify, it's looking to something like this, and everything still corresponds. Now we know the skull has a front plane that's a bit wider, things stick out a little bit more, but in general, think of it as something a little bit closer to that, and then place everything within that context. That's what I recommend here. And so that, by doing that with the eye, that helps achieve that. I also think that you don't really need to overstate the reflected light underneath on the eyelid. Maybe one or two spots, but just treating it as a block already focuses our attention on that eye. And if you can, maybe the eye is important to you, maybe now we can push the darker values in the corners, maybe on the iris, and naturally you will have a little bit of a lighter value on the thickness of the upper eyelid, and that should be enough. I do think that the lower lid, or the bags under the eyes, are a little flat and maybe sort of under modeled. So I would say we can knock them back somehow. We can find where they begin and end in these places. Just try to get them out of the way a little bit, so that we do also not just have an eye that looks like, that tilts from this angle, but also in profile, right? The upper eyelids are sticking out a bit more than the lower eyelids, and to varying degrees, but still, it should happen. And finally, the thing I want to discuss is a little bit on the formation of the ear, and this part right here is the antihelix, and there's usually a cast shadow. Let's get that dark. Cast from the helix onto the antihelix, wraps around in there. And right, it usually bifurcates on top. But the problem with this one is that I think there's not enough sort of changes in how wide it is. So don't make it like this, right? Don't make it equal all the way. It too has to uh, taper and curve in onto itself, and parts of it stick out more, catch more light. This is something to be like kind of like what's happening with the anti-helix here. That is the perfect example of what I'm looking for, right? The anti-helix right here. Oh, sorry, the helix right here is excellent, right? You could see it taper and squeeze and then expand again. A similar thing has to happen up top, inside more and up top with the anti-helix, the inner coil, and then the lobe needs to be a little bit more prominent, and right, you can kind of accent the ear a little bit more in that sense, from around the ear. So yes, excellent job here. Before I go, I do think the lower crura, right, the lower crus of the alar cartilage that's creating the medial part of the nostril does need to be subdued a little bit to be placed in the general shadow of the lower plane of the nose. Excellent. Excellent job on this. Not much is needed to really take this and really make it a solid, completed piece. Not that it wasn't one, but but here and there we can always find things to improve upon. Let's move on. This piece was uploaded by Fabregas, Paulo Fabregas, who, if I'm not mistaken, is the same Paulo Fabregas who was in the coaching program with me as a coach about a year ago now, if I'm not mistaken. And it's great to see him working on paintings, which is not what we were working on in my class. Keep in mind that the coaching program is a great opportunity for you to participate, do all these awesome new Masters Academy classes, but then also send it over to the coaches, myself included, work with someone, get a plan for how to to work your way through the courses, get critiques, and all that stuff. It's an invaluable resource. So definitely check that out on NMA.art. So this is a tough thing, right? Because this is clearly from a photograph. And at the same time, I like a lot of certain, like there are painterly qualities here that I like a lot, especially in the head in the back. This right here is really looking good. There's a feeling of light. All that is really is working out. The hard part about working from photographs is that so much depends on the photograph itself. I think the problem with the head up front is how it captures something that can only be captured with a photograph, right? And then it gives it away. Now, I'm not saying it's bad to work from photographs by any means. I work from photographs all the time. But the key is to kind of pick the photograph that is, there's a little bit more pause there, right? There's something a little bit more contemplative, if you will, that gives you, that can potentially confuse the viewer, right? You could have seen it. This is why a lot of the work of artists who began using photographs in the 1900s looks so convincing. For one, the photograph was usually sort of there wasn't a lot of contrast in terms of these extremely clear and sharp edges of light and shadow. Everything was kept a little bit more painterly and like a softer quality of light. But also, because of the technology of the photograph at the time, in order to capture a photograph, you needed to keep the exposure had to be quite long. So people had to actually stand there and not move. So it wasn't possible to capture what you can do now, which is, some sort of a moment, a fleeting moment that your eye doesn't even like, that your eye can't even comprehend, right? It captures something in between actions as we interpret them and perceive them. So that's something to try to avoid, or, on the other hand, exploit, right? You just have to be aware of what you're after. So a few things here. The head up front is sort of, that's what's happening with that head. So there's nothing I can do with that at the moment, but that's something to just keep in mind. What I do want is to make some painterly changes. For example, let's simplify the shadow side of the head there. And let's make this maybe a clearer, sharper angle, an edge, because that is a sort of like an important point compositionally. That like the overlap of the front head with the arm of the boy in the back. Now, what I do want also is this ear to be smaller. So no matter how large the ear on this kid really was, I doubt it was that big. So I'm just going to knock that back a little bit. What I would also avoid is too much reflected light. I'm always sort of skeptical of it. And I'm going to just soften the reflected light on that arm right there. Maybe get this whole thing, that whole arm can disappear a little bit more, connect a little bit more with the pants there, right? Get this a little bit softer. Now, I'm not saying it needs to remain that soft, but this whole edge in the back there, not a lot of contrast. What is the point of having it, is my question, right? So all of it can be subdued so that we can, and see, once that's done, it gives you a much clearer, a flatter impression of light. This just caught my eye, but maybe something a little more interesting with the trees in the background, a little bit more dynamic as a shape, for example. This up top is a sort of a strange, it's sort of a strange tangent. So that's a question to consider. Maybe it doesn't need to have that line there. Maybe it doesn't need to be that bright either, but that's on me, right? Right? Maybe it doesn't need that, but maybe something else. Maybe there's a shadow that is more fragmented, and that line continues past the head, which gives you a little bit more variation in that corner now, sort of echoing the other corner as well. So that's just some compositional stuff. Now, in terms of accuracy of outline, this arm probably has to have a little bit more curves in the upper portions there, and the bottom, you need to have room for the space between the hand and the arm, so on the carpal bones. Even that much slightly, makes it a little bit more organic. Now, is that, like, the question is compositionally, what is that hand up to? And it too seems a little in like a fragmented kind of a state. It's interesting to have there, but because the whole, like, the pose of that kid, the front character, is as fragmentary as I was talking about, right? Like this, it's all just a moment captured. Now, it all is a moment captured, and the kid in the back, right, is also a moment captured, but one that I believe in more, one that I potentially could have observed with my eyes. This arm, much like the smile, much like the tilt, is a little accidental, right? And by accident, I mean that in the most philosophical, kind of Aristotelian way possible, right? It's something that is non-essential, right? Something that does not belong to the essence of the pose, of the person, of the character. It's something that just happened to be captured, right? That is the main problem with photography when used to convert into paintings. That's not a problem with photography in general. So this other arm, though, I think is, like, just in terms of values, the values of all of the lighter parts are all the same. So this value, this value, this value, this value, all of these are a little too identical. So the question is, what do we push? What do we pull? What do we warm up? Maybe we can just do quickly and see what happens. Possibly, right, this whole arm, maybe it's a little more neutral, maybe it's a little more transparent, but maybe this whole arm we can knock back. Already, that focuses us up top. Maybe the forearm there we can sort of knock back. Even the hand we can knock back. Maybe the head, without losing the chroma, which I might right now, we can bring up in light there, but maybe we can enhance the chroma and bring our attention to the head up front. The head in the back, a similar thing, maybe just a little bit warmer. Maybe there's more of a gradient on the t-shirt, right? Where are we there? Maybe that's down here. Maybe that's knocked back right here, so that our brightest parts are closer to the head and on the shoulder. Once again, focusing our attention somewhere here, right? That is, I think, creating more of a dynamic environment a little bit more. Now, I did soften that edge, but maybe a dark black area down there could be quite effective. Right now, we can make a nice strong contrast somewhere in the back right here. My final critique, though, is this car. And my issue with the car is how perfectly situated it is in this little area, right? It is just right there. You can see it all the way from left to right, top to bottom. And there's almost a tangent of the car against the edge. So I'm a little skeptical of this. Possibly, we can try it, right? Possibly it needed to be more fragmentary. Maybe it needed to be a bit larger in order to be more fragmentary, right? That, let's see, let's try this, perhaps. I'm not saying this is the one solution, right? And let's get rid of this frame. So that car is a little bit closer. Now there's a little bit more of a crop, which is interesting. There's still some weird tangents, but what is most important that I think we could add is possibly a reflection on the glass, right? And maybe the glass in the darks is not as delineated. So all you're seeing is little bits of light, here and there, little bits of light. And that already kind of, makes it a little more believable. Maybe the highlight on the hood, stuff like that. So it's just a matter of composing, of figuring out where things are, what you need, enough variation, but most importantly, it's picking the photo. It's and you could paint any photo, but the question is, how do you make now, there's a whole movement, of course, of artists who painted from photographs. And the whole point was to just enlarge and make sort of larger painterly copies of photographs. That was and still is a movement, and that comes with its own concepts, its own ideas of like the photograph and its importance in our lives, and a bunch of other things that go together here. But I think it's important, if that's what you want to do, is what you want to do. But it's important not to get lost in photography, not to get confused by photography, and allow it to do what it can do so well, and it is in fact allow you to work for longer hours, not have to work from life all the time, be able to manipulate photographs in a way that it's harder sometimes to do from life. There are huge advantages. The thing is, just be aware of them and be aware of potential pitfalls. Okay, I do like this piece, and I do think it there's something there's something um, there's something even touching about it that I like, but I do think it needs a little bit of just a little bit of restructuring, which is what I tried to do here. Okay, with that, I'm moving on. This next piece was submitted by Rachel Atkins, and I happen to like it quite a lot. Now, I know this is very different from the stuff that I generally teach, especially on New Masters Academy. Um, but this takes me back to painting in between courses at the Repin Academy when we went to Crimea, in the south of, it was then Ukraine. Let's not get into the politics of it all. Um, right, painting those mountains. It takes me back to doing a copy of Mont Saint Victoire, the painting of the mountain by Paul Cézanne. He did a lot of them, but there's one particular wonderful painting that I copied in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. So it even has the same, like it's even composed in the same way. So here it's even composed in the same way, right? And there's a little bit of a in the Cézanne one. There's a tree right there, pretty much this amount of sky and a little bit of a path. This is all orange though, and the mountain is blue. But it's still, it brings me back. And also just painting mountains in Crimea, this is sort of what they look like, right? There is this, like they're tall and you're standing real close to them, and the tops often disappear into this haze. So it's definitely conjuring up this mood, and that is exactly what you want from a painting. What I do think needs to happen here, and this is tough in these cases, right? Because there's not that much that I would just go and outright just go and change, right? I don't think that's necessarily the way to do this. Um, I can offer some suggestions, and let's try something a little more painfully. So the I would possibly, right, maybe experiment with slightly sharpening some of the sky against the mountain in the warms, and then of course reintroducing the cools in there, but just allowing, not much, right? Not too much, but just allowing that edge to appear a little bit more in some places, and also kind of an attempt to break up the slight monotony of the purple orange relationships in the sky, right? There's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of small relationship change, like small changes all the way across, but taken as a group, they're all a little bit the same. The sky is very even. So possibly one side a little bit warmer, the other side a little bit cooler, um, right? It's kind of just sometimes, right? You can place, and that kind of changes the mood just a bit, right? Kind of makes your eye move from one side of the page to the other, the canvas. I think that's a fun thing to do. Now, what I would do though is leave these brighter greens. They feel a little colored to me, right? They look a little green out of the tube. So I would push the greens towards something a little bit cooler and slightly darker in value, maybe a little bit more chromatic up top somewhere, right? So where we can kind of remove those slightly colorless bits of green, and then in one or two places really have the brighter greens come up there, right? Maybe along this edge. This gets very soft, and I feel like maybe to really emphasize that, it gets even softer. We lose the mountain entirely over there. Find it in one or two spots, again as the edge there. But in general, I keep that all in a haze. Now, is this all the only way to do this? I'm not so sure. There's probably a lot. What's interesting about this approach is the red outlines, which imitate the outlines in the painting I copied by Paul Cézanne, except in his case they are blue, right? So it's like these outlines were initially placed and then colored in, which um, I think Cézanne would do over and over again. He would start with those outlines and then get rid of them as he painted over them, and then paint new ones on top, and so on and so forth, right? So I also think some of these darker greens, these more intense greens, can really be expanded upon, right? Really, maybe a little bit larger. Maybe the brush itself can become a little bit larger, maybe darker there, right? And just bring more of them into the foreground, um, more of them into these reds, and then reintroduce the reds on top, right? Kind of like what's already happening. Where's that red? Kind of like what's already happening. Keeping things transparent is great here because that's sort of the approach. Keep the opacity, uh, keep the opacity high only in certain areas where you're really catching a lot of light. Now, see, this is just an option to darken the stuff up front. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, um, but that is something to think about, right? Once again, to create a little bit more of this this feeling of like a spatial movement, not just up in a triangle along the two-dimensional plane of the canvas, but also up and away from us along the three-dimensional space of the illusion of the canvas. Now, of course, not to say that we're really being too illusionistic here, and I think that's good. We don't need to be necessarily, but that's where I would, and that's how I would go about this, right? Maybe then cool down some of those contrasts. Maybe up front, there's more opportunity for smaller, more obvious painterly mark making, right? To, once again, not just bring the foreground forward in color, but also in painterly technique. And then finally, I would maybe take these reds and kind of use them the way that I mentioned with Cezanne, right? Use them the way that I mentioned and re-establish some of these outlines, right? Find them again, change them, place them, make them run across the page, only to then maybe go back and get rid of some of them, right? Allow them to be obscured again. And this sort of process of, one layer on top of the other, on top of the other, the complexity of that is what will make this piece, for sure. The one classic rule, though, is let's make sure that our corners, 1, 2, 3, I'm gonna switch into another color, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are different values and colors. The bottom is working. This is sort of the bluish, greenish purple. Here we have the alizarin up top right there. Let's say it's purple, but here I would maybe expand on this, making it a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to remove that and expand on this and just make sure the corner here is warmer, even though in general, so I inverted this a little bit. I'm not saying that's the most dynamic way of doing this, but I inverted so what I did was the following, right? It's warmer up here, cooler towards the mountain. Now it's cooler up here, warmer towards the mountain, and the value changes that come with it, kind of push and pull the mountain away, from view and further away as well. So that's something to keep in mind. I do think there's a lot of potential in this piece. There's a lot of very sort of delicate color sensitivity, painting qualities. I just think it needs, just a little bit more. I didn't want to, if I were painting, I probably wouldn't have kept it so soft, but that's me. I think that softness is something to keep, and I tried to in my critique here. So the best of luck, and yeah, it's a really cool piece. This painting was uploaded by Robert Joyner, and is the final one that I'm going to critique today. And I'm particularly excited by the texture, of course. Now, that's not a very original statement here, because I think that's clearly what the goal was, what Robert was looking to do, and of course the first impression that you get from this piece, and I doubt I'm the only one who has that. What I particularly like is the collage qualities here, right? That is really effective. The collage, what looks like glued paper up here, there's something more if I can see it. There it is. And I've dabbled a little bit in that myself. Collaging paper, painting on top. It's a really, really great way to work. A great way to make big changes, to add textural complexity. All that I think is quite good. So here's what I think I would change here. I'm not so sure I would do too much because there's a lot here I like. And I have a few things though, and they pertain to color harmony. So what is happening with the colors? And this is a personal thing now, because as color most often is. The values and colors on top are extremely high, and from the image, not too chromatic. Now, and that of course is natural, because if you push the values up that much, you can't get the chroma, even though there's still plenty, right? There's still like these sort of the gray blue, the more intense, higher value blue up there, some of the warms in there, the pink, all that's good. But it's creating that big tonal area, and it's functioning more as a tonal area, even though all that color is there, due to the fact that we have all around here what seems like almost pitch black. Now, it might not be, right? This is, of course, the one issue with looking at paintings on a screen, because they go from one photograph to they go from a photograph to to perhaps edited, perhaps not, to a screen, from one screen to the other. Lots change. And I do see, though, that some of it's a little more blue, some of it's a little bit more gray and green. These characters right here look pretty much pitch black. The tires on the car, the shadow here, the shadow right there. All of this is not very chromatic. It's all tonal. And then, in the middle of it all, is just something bright, is a red car, orangey red car, and a cab there, which is also the one chromatic thing. So you got these warmer colors appearing. You have them a little bit on the side there too. So let's see what happens if we reduce this. Like, I come from a school where there, in a sense, a school of painting in general, not necessarily the Repin Academy, but just this sort of type of impressionistic understanding where you have some continuity in chroma. So for example, what if we remove the chroma? Let's just take that same color, bring the chroma down, bring the value down, and let's paint it away, right? Let's just paint that. The yellow car is no longer that, right? That's it. Knock it back. Same with this orange. What if we take that, reduce the chroma a little bit, maybe even reduce the value. Maybe, who knows? We'll see. Right, knock that all back. I'm going to soften it now. Oh, that's way crazy. Sorry. Even though that's kind of cool. Should I keep that? Maybe just not so big. Right? Just knock that back. Now, and of course, that yellow has to go a little bit. We can leave the tiny bits of green and little like tiny chromatic areas. I would also slightly subdue the signature at the bottom due to its intensity of chroma as well. Look what happens. I think as soon as it's removed, look at how effective the painting naturally becomes a bit more tonal. And the light on the cars functions not so much as a pure color that, in a sense, stands out of place in the generally tonal structure of everything around it, but now is like you're feeling a light, you're feeling an atmosphere, you're feeling a mood, you're feeling like a cool atmospheric perspective, the air, the moisture in the air. Now, I'm not saying that's what it was. It might have not been the goal, but that is, I think, very easily achieved by subduing what initially seems as the most extravagant part of the painting, the most interesting part, right? The crazy chroma on the cars. I do want to commend the abstract qualities here, though. I think they're awesome. I think this like splashing of paint and having it come together into a street scene is very effective, and I think that really works well. So that's definitely a solution. I think it's something to think about. So you don't always need to go for those hyperchromatic colors to get that effect. I think the effect of the whole is much more important. But now, what if we remove all that and try it again? Except now, let's take a look, right, again at this whole thing. Now, with the chroma back, clearly, this painting is about something else. This painting is about, like, that coolness of atmosphere is gone. It's no longer a part of the piece, and it's more about a hotter kind of a day, right? You're feeling the heat a little bit more. Okay, so how do we maybe enhance that? What if we just play around with enhancing some of the colors that are already there? Maybe not making that so light. It could still be more or less neutral, right? Just gonna, maybe there's more of these blues. Maybe we can, oh, look at that, that's insane. How is that gonna move around? More of that blue, that red right there, that pink. And I'm just using a round brush. I'm not playing around with the texture that much, right? Getting that in place. So it's just trying to move out of that whole area of, I'm just gonna get rid of all that, and then we'll see how it goes. That's crazy, right? Look at that. Look at that green. Look at how ridiculous that is. Is that exactly what I wanted? Maybe. Who knows? Get those blues in there. I'm gonna switch to maybe this jagged brush. This, right? Just what about those pinks again? What about those pinks? What about, how do we get those pinks in there, back in it? Now, this is obviously a little more intense. So, and then of course I don't want to lose. There was like a lamppost, right? So there was a lamppost there somewhere, right? Some of this gets a little bit softer. There's the palm tree, right? So now I've increased the chroma in the back. Now it's a little bit more flashy, and not my personal taste. I would not have done it this way. I would have done it the original way. But let's take this here too now, right? And let's up the chroma right there. Intense, crazy. That's sort of crazy. Maybe getting that blue purple down there again. Nice. What about this ochre right here? This ochre. Try that again. Ochre, and also a little bit more warm, but a little bit more yellow, a little bit lighter. Smaller brush. Make a mark. Now, I'm ruining some of the cool outlines and highlights and stuff, and the patterns that appear. But that's, my goal isn't to preserve them. That's already there. What about this blue of the? This is the advantage of using the thing that I'm using here, right? Like to use. Right. So now we have something like this, which is of course a little more flashy. Maybe I would even venture to say a little bit gaudy, a tiny bit in terms of color. But however, I didn't want to like totally make everything hyperchromatic, but I made everything slightly more chromatic to kind of unify with the cars. So this is the thing that I'm offering here, right? It's either or. Either and I mean, there are exceptions to this, right? There are exceptions where you maybe can, like, there are wonderful exceptions to this in some really good paintings of flowers that come to mind, right? Where in order to really emphasize the color of the flowers, the background is subdued, made almost totally like there's made highly unchromatic, and then the flowers naturally appear more chromatic against that. The same thing is happening here. It could be done, right? So then you could totally subdue the background, but then you would have to reduce the value contrasts, right? There's too much conflicting originally in terms of like the tonal value situation and the chromatic situation. Both were too contrasty. So in one case, I kept the values, subdued the chroma, and then immediately the colors that were in those not so chromatic parts popped, and the whole thing, we had a very cool atmosphere and mood. The other thing, the other way around it, was to subdue the tonal contrasts and up the chroma. And of course, this allows for a much more imaginary kind of a mood. In this case, it happens to have the green pink sky. You could actually make the sky a little bit warmer, and we could try it with that. Let's see. Let's see what'll happen. Right, so the whole thing can come up and be a little bit warmer up top. Then actually, you can really blast the car, and that could work too, right? You can really push these. So there are options, but think of things as a unit, right? As a relationship in the realm of the painting. What's your main contrast? Is it tonal or is it chromatic? What's the height of your chroma? What is the, as in like, what is the maximum intensity? And the same goes for values. And the same goes for just thinking of the painting as a whole. So that being said, thank you for these. Thank you for uploading them. I love the immense variation in pieces, the different approaches. Really an honor and really a challenge to critique. And I'm super happy to do it. So thank you.
All right, everyone. Those are the critiques. Stay tuned for more to come. We're trying to get them out as fast as possible, getting them to you, making your artistic progress, your artistic education as whole as possible, giving everything we can. I want you to stay as safe as possible, protect yourself, protect your loved ones, protect your families, and I want to give an extra big thank you to everyone who's actually participating in the critiques on New Masters. And the important bit here is that we are trying to get these out as fast as possible, trying to take a look at all the work, pick work, critique it, record it, do all of it. But the idea is that everyone who's posting is at a different point in their education. And so personally, I recommend that you can help by giving constructive criticism to each other. Because if there's anything that really teaches you, what you're doing wrong is when you're trying to explain it to somebody else. So we'll get these out, but I recommend everyone kind of come together as a community and really let's help each other grow as artists. With that, I'll see you soon.